So thank you for coming today. I think this has been a very thought-provoking day, and throughout the day I've heard a lot of what do we do now, what's the next steps, and how do we move forward. So I'm going to let our experts kind of give us some ideas on the Western response and ideas on how we can take the information that we've gotten today and move forward. We have an expert panel. We have Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation, Fred Hutchison from LNG Allies, Marcus Kolga, who's an activist and filmmaker, and Kyle Parker from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So please welcome our panel, and we will start with Luke.
Good afternoon. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers, JBANC and Carl, for extending the very kind invitation for me to come here today on this beautiful afternoon and speak about such an important issue, Baltic security in Central and Eastern Europe, and what do we do next. I have no Baltic heritage in my family as far as I know, although I was just telling Indrek from the Estonian embassy that I do plan on applying for e-residency soon out of solidarity, so perhaps I could start my family's heritage in the Baltics, at least virtually anyway, as long as I'm not liable to pay any Estonian taxes. But my first encounter with the Baltic states and seeing what they really do and how the three punch above their weight in terms of international security was actually in Helmand province about 5 or 6 years ago when I worked for the British. And I saw firsthand the Estonian troops, what they were doing in central Helmand province during the peak of the fighting in Afghanistan, kicking down doors, taking casualties, and killing the enemy. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, what would make this tiny little country in northeast Europe want to go to central Helmand province and do this? And of course, the obvious reason behind is that they hope to become a net security exporter. So in the event that they are in their time of need, that the rest of NATO will be there for them. So, talking about today's topic, how we got here, I want to first, about what we should be doing. I want to first talk about how we got to where we are. Secondly, I want to talk about why the Baltics matter. Thirdly, I want to briefly touch on the kind of Russia we're dealing with, and then talk about our response. So how we got here, I think that we are encountering events today in Ukraine and the South Caucasus and along NATO's eastern border for a number of very bad foreign policy assumptions that were made and the bad foreign policy decisions that resulted from these poor foreign policy assumptions. Some of these assumptions included this idea that Europe is safe and stable and the U.S. no longer needs to be engaged in that region any longer, or that military power no longer buys you the same amount of influence on the world stage that it once did, or that only the big countries really matter in foreign policy. The medium and small countries no longer matter in international affairs, or that Russia is a country that we can do business with, and Vladimir Putin is a man that we can trust. And out of these poor foreign policy assumptions, we had poor foreign policy decision making. So pretty much until recently, a complete disengagement in almost all policy areas in Europe, including from a military point of view, the withdrawal of 2 brigade combat teams and all of their armor, and the A-10 squadron, which amounted to 10,000 troops leaving Europe permanently. Then we had this, we have sliced our military, where we are on track to have the smallest Navy since World War I, the smallest Army since before World War II, and the smallest Air Force ever. And then we have this, the Russian reset, which we can now say is a complete failure. If you remember, you know, Secretary Clinton with her counterpart Lavrov, symbolically, if not awkwardly, pressing that yellow-red button with the word reset wrongly translated. It's very embarrassing. But the mistrust of Russia isn't an Obama administration, isn't unique to just the Obama administration. I remember when President Bush said something along the lines of, you know, I looked Putin in his eyes and I could see his soul. Well, I could tell you Vladimir Putin, as a former KGB guy, looked into Bush's eyes and probably saw a case number. So, you know, this isn't just a problem that we've had going back in this administration. This actually transcends administrations. Now I want to discuss why the Baltic states matter. I think there are 3 reasons why the Baltic states matter from a security and defense point of view. One is that inside the alliance, inside NATO, the Baltic states are geographically isolated, right? They'd be very difficult to reinforce or to liberate or defend in terms of the geography of the alliance. Secondly, they are not unique, but their case is particular because they would rely, their defense and security relies on two non-NATO members, Finland and Sweden. So that adds another dimension to the problem. And finally, just from a purely political point of view in the US, it would be very difficult for any president to explain to the American people why their young sons and daughters might have to go fight and die for a place called Narva. And then I want to talk about the kind of Russia that we have today. Many commentators say that this is a Cold War Russia. I think this is more of an imperial Russia. This is how Russia behaved during the time of the czars. It's about expanding and maximizing territorial influence and military influence and economic influence. Look at Putin, and I would compare him to Nicholas I. Both, presided over stagnant economies, crushed political dissent, had territorial expansion in the South Caucasus, and in the case of Nicholas I, ended it all with a war in Crimea. And then he died from an illness, apparently, so we couldn't see how that would have played out for him, but we'll see how the war in Crimea plays out for Vladimir Putin. Now, dealing with our response, I think we're on the right track, but we need to do a lot more. The increase in Baltic air policing sent the right signals. The increase in rotational forces and the training exercise have sent the right signals. But we have to remember that these could very well be temporary measures because of funding. The funding for these exercises are coming from OCO funding, Overseas Contingency Operation funding, which is temporary and it's hand to mouth, basically. It has to be approved year on year. The Wales Summit was a compromise, right? Let's not fool ourselves into thinking this was some great achievement for NATO's security in the East. It was a compromise based off different national interests that led us to a situation where we don't have permanent forces in the Baltics, but we have rotational forces. We're going to pre-position some equipment, which this is a step in the right direction, but it's just not enough. And don't forget that the number one announcement of the Wales Summit was the creation of this rapid reaction force of about 5,000 troops to respond to a crisis in the East if something were to happen. But before the ink was even dry on the summit communique, we're already hearing problems of Europeans providing the soldiers or the funding to do this. And Europe has 2 million men and women in uniform, and we're having difficulties finding 5,000 that can be ready to respond to a crisis. What do we need to do? I think we have to make it very clear to Russia that there is a line on the map, a literal line on the map. It's not a line like Obama's red line with Syria. Either you're in NATO or you're not in NATO. And if you cross that line, then there are going to be serious consequences. We need to make sure that we have this mentality that it will be far easier to defend the Baltic states and deter Russian aggression than it will be to liberate them. And we need to treat Riga like it was Raleigh, Tallinn like it was Tallahassee, and Vilnius like it was Virginia Beach. Because according to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they mean the same as any place in the United States. And we are obligated as a nation to defend the territorial integrity of the 28 member states of NATO. And if we do not want to do this, then we need to be upfront and honest with our allies. So I think we need to have a permanent presence. We need bricks and mortar. This rotational stuff is fine for now, but we really need to ramp it up. We need to show an enduring commitment to this region. We need to deal with the gray area. We need to find out we need to address the issue of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. They're not NATO material yet, but they could be in the future, and we have to keep them on the right track. And then we need to make sure that Europe does more for their own defense. Europe has a serious defense spending problem. New York City spends more money on its policing than 14 NATO members each spend on their national defense. So the hollowing out of the defense capabilities is not just a problem we have in the US, it's also a problem that we have in Europe. And I would also like to see, in addition to permanent forces being based in the Baltic region, I would like to see something that we used during the Cold War called Reforger, which is an acronym for Return to Forces Germany. It was an annual military exercise that rehearse what we would do in the event of a war with the Warsaw Pact. I'm not saying we need to do it annually, but how long would it take for the U.S. to really send a couple of divisions to Europe to respond to a serious Russian invasion of a NATO country? This all matters to the United States because NATO has done more to bring prosperity and security to Europe than any other organization, including the European Union. And now is not the time to turn our backs on Europe. We in America enjoy the prosperity that has flourished in Europe. Together we are each other's #1 trading partners. Together we create half of the world's GDP. And we have sacrificed over the last almost 100 years a lot of blood and treasure to keep Europe safe and free. You know, more American soldiers died on the very last day of World War I than have died in Afghanistan since 2001. So we've invested already. Now's not the time to turn our backs. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I am Fred Hutchison, LNG Allies. I'm here today for two reasons. I'm here today because Carl comes to every single one of my events, and I owe him deeply for that, but I also am here because the organization that I work for has its origins back to a meeting in the late 2013 when Lithuania had the presidency of the Council, and the Baltics have helped to lead the way in the formation of our coalition, which joins America's oil and gas companies together with the consuming nations in Europe and elsewhere around the globe that desperately need and want both fuel diversity and greater energy security. I'm a little bit amused to be in this particular room because for a dozen years I worked for all the deans of agriculture and natural resources from America's land-grant universities, and they met here. So I can tell you that the only thing that is perhaps a little bit more difficult than being inside in a windowless room on a day like today is being stuck in this hotel with 2 feet of snow and the power out. So, but LNG Allies, as I said, started in 2013. We cooperate with foreign governments through their embassies in the B3, in the Visegrad 4 countries, down through as far south as Bulgaria and Romania, Croatia, into Portugal. Our quest is actually to do something about energy security for our allies. And so we have a bit of a government relations focus because America, and this is, I don't know how many of you know this, it's a fairly unbelievable situation. We have self-imposed limits on the export of our natural gas and the export of our crude oil. Now those arise from a period of time when people were poking around in these places where they knew there was oil and gas, mostly looking for oil, looking, if you saw the front of the program, looking for a dot within that little yellow piece of the front of the program. And what has happened in the last 10 years is that outer ring, that outer blue ring now represents the actual extent of the opportunity to recover oil and gas in the United States. The Energy Information Administration releases an annual review, and this year it came out last week, as has been true in previous years. The growth in our reserves is nothing less than astounding. We have truly unbelievable quantities of both natural gas liquids, and light crude oil as well. It puts us in a totally different place from where we have been. 10 years ago, there were 7 or 8 terminals in the United States that were built with the expectation that we were going to have to import natural gas from Qatar or other parts of the world. And the gas essentially never materialized in most of those terminals because as the shale revolution hit America, those companies one very large one, Cheniere, which now is going to supply 40% of the gas for Spain, which is going to have as much productive capacity as Qatar has in the production of natural gas. They went through bankruptcy, but have emerged to now create export terminals so that we can export this. And we can do this without harming consumers. Prices won't go up, without hurting our chemical and fertilizer companies who are back in force in the United States. So there's an immense opportunity if the United States will get out of its own way and live by its free market, free trade principles to really do some good in some countries. And the Baltics represent an amazing opportunity. Lithuania has their own floating import terminal, which has been leased for 10 years from a Norwegian company. That terminal has the capacity to supply all of Lithuania's needs, to supply Latvia and Estonia as well. The interconnections are there with the Baltics. Poland is building a terminal which should be completed later this year. Croatia has one under active development. There are some long-term needs to build interconnectors through that part of Europe. What the energy situation in Eastern Europe is a function of the relics of a Soviet system that was designed explicitly to leave those countries dependent upon Russia for their oil and gas. And so the pipelines tend to flow from east to west. We need connections from north to south. So in the short term, America this year will start to export LNG. The first gas will come out of Cheniere's project in Sabine Pass. We have 4 or 5 other very large projects that are coming online over the next 4 or 5 years. I'm working with about 15 companies that are still waiting their licenses and their permits with the Department of Energy. But we have an amazing opportunity, and it's a commercial opportunity as much as anything else. And even though a lot of these gas-consuming companies in Europe are state-owned enterprises, nonetheless, it has to make commercial sense. We think it does. We think it's going to be a very, very interesting and amazing future. I have to apologize for you, our organization, to you a little bit, because I can't really address the question of a response, because our organization was founded on the premise that we ought to be proactive just because it would be a wise and sensible thing to do. We were in formation prior to the invasion of Crimea, prior to the development of situation in Ukraine. You know, Russia's going to be a supplier of gas to this part of the world for a very long time. But having alternatives is very important, because what Lithuania found, that even before their terminal had arrived in the port of Klaipėda, that when they sat down with Gazprom to renegotiate their contract, because they had a viable alternative, they were able to get a 27% reduction in the price of their contracts with Gazprom. So things are moving forward. I have on my night table a book that I want to read by Pillsbury that talks about China's 100-year marathon. You know, and I maybe more than some of the others of you have some real personal reasons to care about what goes on in this region. My wife's Ukrainian. She immigrated in 2003. Our son just immigrated from Sevastopol in the end of December with his fiancée. We have land in Crimea. It is a very personal thing for me, but our response and my response, I think, is got to take a longer-term view, because yes, this immediate situation requires military and other kinds of responses to it, but if we continue to work collaboratively, I think in 10 years we will look back on the particular period and we will see those ties, at least from an energy standpoint, from both gas and I think very shortly for crude oil as well, to really show that cooperation is not only possible but profitable for all sides. So thank you again, Carl, for the opportunity to be here. Honestly, my wife and I are going to do something this summer that I'm just hugely excited about. We're going to get to do a little road trip to this part of the world. So I'm going to see her favorite aunt who lives in Vilnius and get up to Klaipėda and go up the coast. And the only thing I can't figure out is how we get the car back from Tallinn back to Frankfurt. So if somebody can help me figure that one out, I'd appreciate it. So thank you.
I'm Marcus Kolga. Much like Fred, I'm also here because Carl comes to all of my events in Toronto, so I decided to come down. Carl was actually just in Toronto about 2 weeks ago when I organized a mini conference at the University of Toronto with Bill Browder and with Finnish writer Sophie Oksanen. He arrived, actually, his panel had started and we had no idea where he was, and he turned up as the introductions were being made. He ran down the aisle in the theater and came up on stage. Apparently he'd made a wrong left-hand turn somewhere in Pennsylvania or something like that. Thanks to JBANC for inviting me here for my third conference and for all the great work that they continue to do on behalf of the Baltic communities, not just here in the US, but worldwide. Carl, as most of us know, is the guy that makes it all happen, and he's an incredible asset, and it's an honor for me to call him my friend. And I'd also like to thank all these superstar panelists that have been here today. As John Schindler put it in a tweet earlier this week, it was a complete Putin-palooza, so it was fantastic. Anti-Putin. I'm going to break my short talk into two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about English language media for the Baltics and what we need to do to produce an effective counter-narrative against the Russian propaganda Goliath. Second, I'll talk about some of the policy positions the Canadian government has taken and where we're headed with future policy. 4 years ago, at this same conference, I talked about the need to develop a common English language media platform for the Baltic and Nordic region. Something that I'd already done between 2000 and 2004 with a weekly North American print newspaper with a circulation of 50,000 called The Northern European, but it was a bit ahead of its time, and Finnair, who was the primary advertiser, switched their sort of strategy from North America to Asia, and that was it. But already back then we were talking about RT and the disturbingly biased messaging that it transmits, as well as the rapid, alarming growth of RT's North American audience and the need for the Baltic states to come together and develop an effective English language platform with a credible counter-narrative to compete with the distortion of truth by state media and Kremlin propagandists. Earlier, Jamie had mentioned that RT is available in all sorts of hotels across North America. A Nielsen poll in 2009-2010 actually showed that RT is the most viewed international news channel in all major U.S. hotel markets, above BBC, above all the others. All three Baltic states eventually responded and started looking at solutions, some more seriously than others, but look, they did. But instead of working together, they created English language national media silos. The Estonians took news from the national broadcaster ERR, local news that is written for Estonians in Estonia, and funded bare-bones English language translations of the content in hopes that it would fill the gap. The Estonian broadcaster, for whatever reason, didn't understand that most people outside their borders wouldn't find negotiations about the federal budget interesting without the context of why those discussions are important on a national level, never mind a regional level. Or, for example, when President Ilves gives a speech about national foreign policy or defense policy, that rarely actually gets reported on the ERR English language service. When reading it, one gets the impression that the primary audience is either the local English-speaking expat community or Estonians who prefer reading news in English or a few thousand global Estophiles, but certainly not a broad international audience. The Latvian government over the past year has done a much better job in developing the English language media version of their national media. They hired a wonderfully talented Englishman named Mike Collier to run their media, who understands who his primary audience is or hopes it will become by publishing pieces that are broadly relevant. The Lithuanians, on the other hand, have gone the private route with Delphi, publishing Lithuanian Tribune articles in English. Sadly, the exposure of these pieces also target the relatively limited Lithuanian and Baltophile communities. Neither ERR or LSM offer any real analytics for their English language services. I think they're developing these things, so statistics about who's using their services. And sadly, despite the resources that are available, I would be forced to guess that most of the Latvians and Lithuanians in this room have never looked at the ERR English language site, and I'd probably say the same that most of the Estonians and Lithuanians in this room haven't looked at the Latvian state media site. Out of Canada, and I'd also argue Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and the US, a group of concerned journalists, writers, and experts are supporting a Nordic and Baltic region media platform, one that wouldn't specifically focus on EU agricultural subsidies to dairy farmers in northern Latvia, but would include those specific issues in wider contextualized pieces. I spoke about this project 4 years ago, but it took a moment like the invasion of Crimea to motivate some of us to start actively working on this project that we've lovingly named Up North. Currently, Up North is a curated site with some exclusive pieces, but we're working towards creating broad investigative and analysis pieces, talk radio and TV that appeal to a regional and global audience. Up North isn't meant to deliver Latvian news to Latvians or Estonian news to Estonians, but to their neighbors. So Estonian news to Latvians, Swedes, and Finns to create a far more regional, sort of broad regional understanding. In fact, today's entire conference is being live fed to our YouTube channel. Some of the region's greatest thinkers have also endorsed and contributed to Up North, including Anne Applebaum, Ed Lucas, Sophie Oksanen, Mikhail Shishkin, and pieces by the always amazing Paul Goebel appear as well. And apparently we're starting to connect with the right people, and we're getting under the skin of the right people. You may have all heard of a Russian pianist who was hired by the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, who was to play Rachmaninoff at the TSO last week, but was told not to show up after the symphony cited a long string of racist hate that was published by the pianist's social media account, or on the social media account of this pianist. Last week I wrote a piece that looked at a famous Nazi-era pianist, Ellie Ney, who was banned from ever playing again in the city of Bonn due to her Nazi activities anti-Semitism. And this same Russian pianist, who actively translates propaganda for pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine and publishes a constant stream of vicious material that the TSO recognized as being hateful, so the piece sort of looked at the two different pianists. Yesterday morning, when I landed in Washington and turned on my Wi-Fi, there were over 30 notifications on my Twitter feed. According to these, the followers of this pianist, I am a lying, gay, neo-Nazi, and also a strong Israeli supporter. It was just bizarre, the different sort of the profanity that was used and the colorful language. And that was all due to a passage I quoted from our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, in which her replacement pianist called the Russian pianist, or had said that the Russian pianist had rallied her supporters to attack members of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra when they showed up for the replacement pianist's show. Hundreds of Putin's neo-fascist trolls descended upon my Twitter feed and insisted on seeing, and instead of seeing the American Museum of History yesterday afternoon as I intended, I sat in my hotel room and blocked over 500 trolls from my account, and I've been doing so throughout the day. It's pretty phenomenal. If you have an iPhone and I've got it set to buzz, the thing just kept on buzzing all day in my pocket. So again, our little media Up North is clearly connecting with the right people and defending the right ones as well. Just quickly about some of the policies that are moving along in Canada right now. I just want to mention that for several years now we've been trying to replicate what you've done here in the U.S. with Magnitsky legislation, and I bow to this gentleman beside me, Kyle Parker, and Carl, who worked so hard to get Magnitsky legislation passed here in this country. We're finally, it looks like we're breaking through in Canada, but sadly that was due to the untimely murder of Boris Nemtsov. But after Boris's murder, a number of MPs and ministers actually called me and said, how can we get this moving? How can we do this? And it looks like that now there's some real strong motivation to get this going, and I'm pretty confident that something will thankfully be passed by the summer. And again, thanks so much to people like Kyle and Bill and Carl for inspiring us in Canada. One of the other things, a huge concern in Canada, is Russian language media, which is it's prevalent in the Russian diaspora. There are some 400,000 Russians living in Canada right now, and they primarily get their news from Russian language media. So there's also a big effort to change policy and to strip these Russian language channels of their licenses to be broadcast in Canada, because they are producing an enormous amount of influence within these communities, and they're trying to sway others as well as policy. And that's it. Thanks again so much for having me. Thank you, Carl, for everything that you do, and JBANC as well.
Take a little bit of the mic here.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thanks, Ingrida, and thank you, Carl, for your kind invitation to be here at my second JBANC conference. It's nice to be back with so many old friends and so many good friends of freedom. From my position in Congress, I interact with a lot of diaspora groups that work the Hill. Many, understandably, focus on their narrow parochial interests, but JBANC is not one of those groups. Over the years, I've been honored to be in the legislative trenches with JBANC, whether working to pass the Belarus Democracy Act, the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, or more recently, the Ukraine Freedom Support Act. Unlike some groups on the Hill that organize under the slogan of the friends of this or that country, when in fact they are much friendlier to the government of this or that country, JBANC is a true friend of the people of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and this entire region of Europe, and a great example of the truth of that beloved borderlands rallying cry for our freedom and yours. Given the other expertise on this panel, I'll confine my brief remarks to the general political dimension and will be happy to answer specific questions on the view from Congress, with the usual disclaimer that I'm just a staffer with an opinion and not speaking in any official capacity. As a way of getting at our what is to be done theme, let me start with my take on the problem we supposedly need to do something about. Russia's aggression in Ukraine over the past year is a textbook vindication of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's concept of comprehensive security. This is, of course, distinct from NATO's concept of collective security, and simply means that how a government treats its own people will inevitably affect its foreign policy. As the OSCE's 1991 Moscow document puts it, and I'm paraphrasing, matters like respect for human rights and the rule of law are of such paramount importance that concern for such matters can never be dismissed as meddling or interference in the internal affairs of the state in question. As I see it, the collapse of the rule of law in Russia led directly to a war in Europe, a real war, with tanks and artillery, POWs and refugees, and thousands dead. This isn't about geopolitics, whatever that means anyway, but about the protection of Vladimir Putin personally and his system, Putinism. And the simplest definition of Putinism that I've heard is that Russia isn't governed, it is ruled, and it is owned by those who rule it. So what's happening here is more like a game of Monopoly than it is a game of Risk. Today's Kremlin isn't so much ideological as it is cynicism itself, whipping its new obscurantant base into a Slavic Ashura of sorts by telling them inflammatory things that are not really believed by the Kremlin. If Ukraine's Orange Revolution spooked the spooks in Moscow, and it did, crowds on the streets across Russia in late 2011 and early 2012 heightened their fears by an order of magnitude. And they went into full panic when Yanukovych fled Ukraine under the cover of darkness last year. This all happened in a situation that few could have predicted, and against the backdrop of a discontent similar to that which animated the earlier Russian protests. The targets of all of these protests are essentially the same thieves and crooks that Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny so effectively tarred and feathered a few years ago. And thus Putin reacted as if his very survival was at stake, because, in a sense, it was, and is. Put simply, the revolution must be stopped at Kiev, lest it spread. And preventing the emergence of a successful Russian-speaking democracy loomed a larger concern than the normal concern over a potentially hostile state on one's border. Indeed, Putin's actions to thwart the revolution have all but assured a hostile Ukraine for generations to come, shifted public opinion on NATO, and caused a new springtime of Ukrainian national identity. Now, Putin appears to prefer to corrupt from the inside, as he did successfully following the Orange Revolution, than to use overt force. But force has already been used and will be used if needed to accomplish this goal. This is why I posit that serious non-military assistance to Kiev may be as provocative as lethal military aid, since Moscow's goal isn't so much territorial at this point as it is the demise of the spirit of Maidan. Both sorts of assistance should be given. This is also why the frozen conflict analogy is misleading. First, none of the other so-called frozen conflicts are rooted in Moscow's perception of an existential threat. And second, the conflict is only likely to be frozen insofar as Kiev is dysfunctional. When Kiev succeeds, the line of contact must move westward to keep Ukraine's new government distracted and divided. And this is where we come in. We cannot let this happen, and we must not allow Kiev to fail before Putinism succumbs to its own internal contradictions and is consigned to the proverbial ash heap. It will be much easier to do this with robust cooperation from other partners, but we must be prepared to lead and to do it alone if necessary. Kiev must be supported and encouraged, or propped up and even kept on life support, until the people of Russia finally come to their senses and recognize the thieves and crooks in the Kremlin as the real reason for their current malaise, and see them as the true enemies of a strong and prosperous Russia. Enemies who are shrewd calculators of their short-term personal interests, while ignoring the people of Russia's long-term national interests, as they stoke tension and wars in their own backyard, sell the country out to China, and deny the people their rightful participation in politics and indeed in reality itself by subjecting them to a blinding propaganda campaign. The cost to the West of continuing to act as if this war is merely an inconvenience on the periphery and not a direct threat to the international order and to decades of U.S. investment in lives and treasure to securing a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace will be much greater than meeting this challenge now directly and decisively. Let me conclude with 5 general suggestions that should inform our response going forward. First, we shouldn't rule anything out. We don't know how this will end and are already now resorting to measures that were unthinkable even a year or so ago. Second, avoid talk of thermonuclear war or nuclear war. It's absurd, and talk like this favors and feeds the Kremlin's narrative. Third, come to believe. First, in our own rhetoric about the crisis and the threat. And second, in what Putin tells us by his deeds and his words, no matter how uncomfortable those are. Putin is not so much hard to read and hard to understand as he is hard to stomach. Fourth, acceptance. True partnership and accommodation with Putin and his system are no longer possible. Containment, in the literal sense of keeping Russia inside its internationally recognized borders, is what is instead must be pursued. And last, understand that this problem began in Moscow, not in Kiev, and will end there. What happens inside Russia has its own dynamic tension and is largely beyond our ability to influence. But try we must, at least in hopes of keeping the light of civil society alive and not breaking faith with those Russians who, at great personal risk, seek an alternative future for their country. Thanks again for the privilege of addressing such an august group, and I look forward to getting into specifics during our discussion.
Thank you. So before we open it up to the group, are there any questions among the panelists that you'd like to ask of each other? Hearing none. Is there anybody from the audience that would like to ask a question?
It's on. Clearly, energy and particularly natural gas gives Russia a tremendous leverage over Europe and particularly Eastern Europe. I was very glad to hear Fred talk about one of the options, which is to bring LNG to Europe itself. But beyond that, Eastern Europe has many of the same kind of shale oil and gas resources that stretch from southern Lithuania down through Poland, through Ukraine, into Bulgaria and Romania, etc. It took 25 years for the U.S. to kind of crack open this type of resource. And my question is, given how slowly things have emerged in particularly the Eastern European countries, and given the title of the panel, what should be the Western response?
These countries do, in fact, have shale resources. You know, you have to remember Romania has always been a traditional powerhouse. Poland has resources, as do other countries. You have some geological differences, but you also have vast technological differences. As it's really been explained to me, the state of knowledge of our industry is very much a proprietary advantage of ours, and it's one that, you know, through some technology transfer would be very helpful. But the other thing that's really amazed, I guess there's two other real important differences, and one is just ownership differences. You know, here in the United States, the surface owner owns the mineral rights, and that's not true in some of these other nations. And the other thing is we have an enormously, even though there's some places where there are some missing pieces, we have a very robust pipeline transportation system to get that gas, except out of places like North Dakota. So there's some great hope. I think it'll come over a period of time. But honestly, it's going to be a decade or more, I think, before there's any real progress.
And just to follow on from what Fred was saying, and to follow on from the earlier conversation about Russian propaganda, you know, this is a prime target for Russian established or Russian funded NGOs, environmental groups that all of a sudden spring up in places like Romania or Bulgaria to try to counter any fracking opportunities and to parrot the anti-fracking message. So, you know, we talk about media influencing the debate. We also, we shouldn't forget about the NGOs that are funded by Moscow too.
I would also just note that apart from the shale and the things that have happened, Europe is in a much better place than it was a few years ago in terms of energy. A lot has been done in terms of reverse flow, reserves, other things. It's still stark when you look at the map and you see that if Moscow flips off, you know, the switch, some countries may have a year or so before they feel it. Yeah. Other countries feel it immediately, and they can even be right next to each other, just depending on the infrastructure. I think it's also important to look at the fact that Moscow is in a much weaker position economically to be able to afford the cost of playing with its European customers in this way. So there's a bright spot there.
Yeah, I think some of those responses were good. I don't know if you want to wait 25 years to go after the shale resources that exist there. Clearly, the response that Luke, you made of the propaganda to basically fight that, Romania, even France, has bans against fracking, and there's no scientific basis for that. And, you know, on the land use, Canada has a similar land use issue. They've been able to overcome it. I think I would like to see a much more proactive type of response to capture this opportunity than just kind of, let's wait and see.
Well, we're being live streamed, so I can't tell you exactly what's going on, but I can tell you there are very active activities going on in just that arena. So.
Just a really quick question for the panel. What is more powerful when it comes to the West stopping Russia? Is it military strength or economic influence?
Well, such an absolute question, I think, requires an absolute answer, which is military strength at the end of the day. That is what will, if it comes to it, that is what will stop and roll back Russia. It's how you get to that point and how you avoid getting to that point. You use economic, diplomatic levers. But at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, It's military power, and that's why our #1 priority now is to be able to defend the territorial integrity of the 28 member states of NATO. That is our #1 priority. That doesn't mean we don't do anything else in Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, but our responsibility is to the member states of NATO. Too often we think the world is black and white. It's surge or withdrawal, it's engagement or isolation. The alternative to grand military intervention in Ukraine isn't to do nothing at all. There's something in between that we could and we should be doing. In some cases we are doing. But to answer your question, military power.
To understand the adequacy of West's response to Russia's aggression, we need to understand the magnitude of what's going on. As Kyle mentioned, it's a full-fledged war that's happening in the middle of Europe, which, according to the latest UN report, resulted in 6,000 dead, 15,000 wounded, and 1 million displaced persons. We in Ukraine appreciate the response of the global community condemning Russian aggression, but the fact remains that the response so far has not been able to stop it, and it's not stopping its continuation now, because despite the ceasefire and Minsk agreements, just today, April 18th, there were 24 instances of ceasefire violations and shellings of Ukraine's positions with the use of high-caliber guns that should have been withdrawn according to the February ceasefire. And since the ceasefire in February, almost 100 people died, 500 people wounded. So the response so far has not been adequate. And I believe that the response should be a much stronger demonstration of resolve on the part of the West in general, that aggression will not be tolerated. And a part of that response would be the provision of lethal weapons to Ukraine, as well as countering Russian propaganda and much stronger economic assistance. I would appreciate your comments on this. Thank you.
All right. I agree. I think now's the right time to start giving defensive weapons, anti-tank weapons, counter-battery artillery, which would be really helpful in allowing the Ukrainian forces to identify the point of origin of incoming artillery and rocket fire to quickly respond. But sometimes we think that this is the next headline and this is going to be the silver bullet to this problem. And this needs to be part of a long-term solution on how we deal with Russia in the long term, whether it's in Ukraine, the Baltics, the Caucasus, East Asia. We have to have a very comprehensive strategy. There's a lot of hesitancy in Washington to offer these weapons, and for the life of me, and in Europe as well. And if I was a Ukrainian soldier fighting for my country's survival in eastern Ukraine, I would find it awfully curious that we're so willing to provide these similar weapons to Peshmerga fighters in northern Iraq, to moderates in Syria and Libya, but yet our own European brothers and cousins we will not provide these weapons to. So keep banging the drum, and hopefully we can get a change of policy here in Washington.
I know from the Canadian perspective, the assistance that we're providing is slowly escalating, and so we've sent over several hundred members of our military to help train the Ukrainian military, and I'm sure that lethal weapons they're coming, they're in the pipeline. So, but we're sort of, overall, I think the Canadian policy has been quite good overall in the region, and we're a little bit nervous looking down at what's going on here, that there's a real lack of leadership, I think, on a lot of issues in Eastern Europe. So we're a little bit nervous. We're looking forward to the upcoming election, and maybe in 18 months things won't be the same. But
I would just note on the disagreement that was mentioned as far as lethal aid is concerned, at least in Washington, there's not a whole lot of disagreement, but the disagreement is stuck where it matters. Congress has spoken very clearly on this. We had our first recorded vote on arming Ukraine about a month ago, and it was an overwhelming vote. It was the first recorded vote in either chamber. It was in the House. Would also say that one of my worries about the focus at the moment on lethal aid, it's it's kind of like a thing, right? It's easy to talk about. It's easy to hammer the president on if you want to do that. And my worry is that it distracts from some of the other things that we should be doing, that we could be doing. There's a lot more we can be doing in terms of security assistance that needs to be ramped up, needs to be, some of the counter-fire radars you've spoken about, we're already providing. There's some that are longer distance that have not yet been provided. We have, I guess, something of 300 paratroopers in Lviv as we speak, training exercise. And the other point about the response, my concern is some of the adequacy lies in the incrementalism of it. The measures we have in place right now are fairly robust and might have had a much bigger deterring power had they been invoked much faster and perhaps even all at once, although it's hard to imagine that at the moment with where Europe was at the time. But some of it is in meeting Russia's advance incrementally. And so we get sucked into this unpleasant situation of conserving a moving status quo that was unacceptable until the last moment it moved. And then it's preferable to where it is now.
Hello, dear speakers. My name is Nikolai Vorobyov. I'm a Ukrainian journalist and head of organization of Center for Eastern European Perspectives. I write for Ukrainian media outlets simultaneously. And thanks for this conference, actually. I wish I could see here more Ukrainians. And I was on Euromaidan since the beginning. Last year, I spent enough time in battle zone, so I'm quite aware with the situation. And I just recently came back from Kyiv like 2 weeks ago. And let's talk about non-military things. I mean, in our case, sometimes government use the war, the battle zone, like an excuse for not doing reforms. So the question is, I mean, we receive this support from the West, which I really appreciate. And but people don't see anything is changing in case with corruption, and the economy is suffering a lot. So there are two questions about this. So how do you have any, like, to Congressman, member of Congress? The first, do you have any control of these expenditures when you send any support to Ukraine? And how much time do we have for these reforms? Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure we have 10 years because, like, the situation. I mean, in my case, I interviewed many people, like, from civil society, militaries. I have a lot of veterans who are my friends in battle zone. And actually, they understand that Putin, he just, like, currently has stepped back and he is waiting when Ukrainian government, if you want, will diminish itself, because people become more angry, more upset on the reforms and so on. So I'm trying to describe the reality on the ground, like with the business, with the pensions and so on. So our currency dropped like per 3 or 4 times. So like people are very disappointed. But what do you think? What the West can the West intervene actually in this situation, just doing maybe some reforms by itself, I don't know, or send more experts, or have some control of the money, Western funds money expenditures? What do you think about the control? Not to feed like old bureaucracy, old Soviet bureaucracy, which unfortunately still exists, but maybe we can do more difference from here to do a real reforms, not only a vision of reforms. Because I'm talking on behalf of like middle class, and like maybe in lower class. So
let me just
thank you.
Get you there. There's conditionality placed on the assistance at the time that it's enacted, and variety of stages. I think the biggest assistance is the Treasury's loan guarantee program that envisions up to $3 billion by the end of this year, subject to a variety of conditions. One of the concerns, however, in Congress, in certain quarters, is that there's too much conditionality, perhaps. That it's not so much. I don't want to construe it as a turning a blind eye to the corruption that is absolutely there and real, and it's frustrating, and we hear that. I mean, Ukraine remains a very corrupt country. At the same time, you look at why is the United States giving this assistance, right? Some of it, of course, is you look in the values basket of supporting folks who are striving to universal values and the things we respect. Others, really very hard interest of saying Ukraine must not fail. And even if it means potentially, propping up and prolonging a government that is imperfect, we don't want to have an unrealistically high standard that can't be met in a war zone when Ukraine is staring down the Russian state, and have the country fail, and what that means, not simply in a moral sense of our disappointment, but what that means for Europe. Ukraine is the largest country wholly inside of Europe. The numbers that have been cited, 6,000 dead, thousands more wounded, those are probably very low, given what we suspect might actually be the case, and you still have a population of about 5 million in the conflict zone, with fears that there could be a wider offensive, with Russia ready to do stuff with hours of notice. So I understand and I get it, and it's frustrating. Some of this is going to have to be for your compatriots inside Ukraine to encourage folks to, preserve the ideals of why everyone came out to the Maidan in the first place. I don't know if that gets at some of your question.
I was in Kyiv about 10 days ago and had various meetings with members of parliament, commentators, think tank types. And the best way I could describe what the government is trying to do right now, it's like building a ship while you're already out at sea. They're trying to reform, they're trying to democratize, they're trying to fight corruption while they're trying to fight a Russian invasion, quell an insurgency, deal with the fact that 5% of their country is now annexed to Russia. So there's a lot of things going on. But you hit the nail on the head. I left pessimistic in terms of corruption being probably right after the fact that there are Russian soldiers on your territory. I would say corruption is probably the second biggest issue facing the government. I think expectations are sort of really high in the West, but also in Ukraine on what the government's going to deliver. And the message I got was that the government there's a real possibility that the government could fall and there could be another Maidan in 12 to 18 months. And now you have all these volunteer battalions armed to the teeth, young men fighting, carrying a very heavy burden for their country. And they're not incorporated into the mainstream armed forces. And besides young men and women throwing Molotov cocktails and rocks to fight for their freedom, you're going to have volunteer battalions fully armed to the teeth marching on the Maidan. I'm not just pulling this stuff out of thin air. This was a message I received as a real possibility from various people I spoke with. So I think we need to help keep Ukraine on the right track. We need to lower expectations. We need to make sure that the Ukrainian government stays on the right path. We need to guide them on that path, but it's very much a process, not an event. Another Maidan is not going to bring a transparent, non-corrupt government, but a process, a generational change will.
So how can you evaluate reforms? Is it effective? What are your perspectives? Reforms in Ukraine, is it effective?
Well, it seems to me that there are good legislative initiatives in the Rada, but there's very little political will to pass this legislation and to break the back of the oligarchs. We talk about arming Ukraine with javelins. Well, there are Ukrainian soldiers that get sent to the front line wearing tennis shoes because it takes a bribe pretty much from the upper echelons of the military down to the supply sergeant to get a pair of boots. So what do these young men do? They go to the oligarch and join their battalion, and they get the latest and greatest assault rifle, body armor, cool Ray-Ban shades, helmet, and they get sent there and they feel like soldiers and they fight like soldiers. So corruption is a big problem. And I think once you break the back of the control the oligarchs have in the country, perhaps we should look at the electoral system. Half of the members of parliament are voted on a list. So there's no direct accountability by the person casting the vote. Basically, they vote for a party, then the oligarch decides, who becomes the MP. There are huge problems that Ukraine faces that we have to help them with and keep them on the right path. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I have a question or two. A lot of us out here have been in protests in the past, and we've written our members of Congress in the past, and we've kept our passions alive through the years, and I think now there's a renewed sense of needing to do something. In the current bandwidth of the media, I mean, you've got your snippets of this and your snippets of that, and you get very little time. You know, we were just talking up here that the news finds it more important that a woman in Texas shot a cat with a crossbow than what's going on in the Ukraine. So how do we, all that are here, take and increase that bandwidth? You know, increase them. You know, the presence in the media. What are our marching orders, I guess, from your standpoint of what we need to do to keep this going, to really make this a big issue so that it really becomes more important, whether it be for the White House, for the press, or for others?
I would say that, and what you mentioned about a cat with a crossbow or whatever news story it was, I'm sort of resigned to the fact that it's probably always going to be that way, and that you can look at, you know, on the one hand, I mean, there's a bright spot insofar as that the constituencies and groups that affect policy in this part of the world are small enough that groups can actually have an influence, right? That you actually, it doesn't take a whole lot. I mean, you look at sometimes the fiction of Congress and hearings, and they don't like to turn the camera around and show you that the room is empty, right? The room is empty, but you shouldn't take any comfort in the fact that there's only one or two people doing there, because they can do great good or great damage. You know, so it doesn't. You know, you don't need this to be on the TV across the United States. That said, when we get into upper level responses and things that, you know, depending on where this goes, again, we don't know how it ends, there is really a need for top level, at the very top, political leadership, if we're going to be asking the American people to spend substantial sums of money and to take serious risks. And you know, again, that's something that we simply can't rule out, not knowing how this ends, and I don't think Vladimir Putin knows how this ends either. But you know, groups like JBANC have been able to accomplish a lot in, you know, walking around Capitol Hill and holding these conferences and doing things like that. So.
Well, I'd say in Canada as well, the Ukrainian community there, it's quite substantial, over 1.5 million people, and they're very well organized, and they have put on constant pressure onto the media and government. And of course the Ukrainian stories, they disappear from the front page, but I think the Ukrainian community and the Central and Eastern European community in general in Canada have done a pretty good job. That the story never completely disappears from the newspaper either. So, and we also contextualize that news and make sure that there's always a Canadian angle, which is very important for the Canadian media. So we always have that little trick that we can use to make sure that there's a Canadian angle in there, and they'll generally pick up on the news. So we're actually not doing too badly in Canada.
Any other comments?
One thing I just neglected to mention, the business community and the level of business engagement between the countries. To me, that's really the ballast in the relationship. That's, you know, we lack that with Russia, which is good and bad. You know, on the upside for our concerns, it means that the business community, when it's concerned about sort of staying the hand of sanctions, isn't able to even punch its own weight, let alone above it. On the downside, it again means that without a real district interest, without jobs at stake, without people who are involved, you're simply going to get the people who are enthusiasts, who really deeply care about the issue, but you need a little more than that. And, you know, one idea along those lines, we're looking at response, look at the TTIP, right? We've got TPA legislation now introduced. There's still a long ways to go, and you know, the Asian deal has to come first. But something like that, which on the merits alone makes a lot of sense in, you know, for the trade reasons, but also can be done for securing the transatlantic bond. You know, and if you want to sign up for it as a way to, you know, stick a finger in the eye of Vladimir Putin, then join the coalition as well. But there are things like that that will bring these issues a little bit more to the forefront and keep them there.
Yes.
Yes, hello. Robert Skulkainis from Greenville, South Carolina. My question is for Mr. Coffey. Mr. Coffey, at the beginning you said, you spoke very clearly, and you said there's a need to have a clear statement of, you know, what happens if there is a type of aggression in example, the Baltic states, and make it clear that there will be serious consequences. The question is, what does serious consequences mean? Or is it better to let that be left unsaid and have just Article 5 speak toward what serious consequences are? In effect, you know, you telling me that you're not going to answer the question. which is okay.
I'll answer the question. There is some merit in having this sort of what they call strategic ambiguity on some issues, but I think in this particular case, there needs to be a leadership from the United States on what would happen if Russia were to attack a Baltic state, for example, that there would be a military response immediately. There'd be actions taken to liberate and then defend the borders of every NATO member state that came under attack. And the reason why I think we should make that very clear right now is because let's not forget that Article 5 is a political decision. It's not a trigger. Often we think it's a trigger, but there has to be consensus by all 28 on, in the NAC on what constitutes an attack. So if we set the standard now, what we think an attack would be, then we can make it clear to our allies and to Russia where that line is. But right now, we cannot really, in my opinion, do this to defend and deter Russian aggression to the best of our ability. Yes, we have in each Baltic state and Poland 150 troops. This amounts to a company. We've increased a few more fighter jets for the air policing mission. But you cannot really tell me that 150 U.S. troops in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia is really going to be a deterrent, right? So then you hear this argument that, well, there would be a good tripwire to draw America into the war. Well, I can tell you as a former soldier, you never want to go into a mission where you're the tripwire. Either we go all the way and we do it properly, or we have this serious debate, as I said, where we have this debate with our European partners and say, well, we're not so sure if we really want to do this. And I think that'd be terrible, and we'd have some soul searching to do as a nation. But permanent forces, I don't know what the exact number is, but I'll tell you it's more than 150 soldiers. And we need to show that we are really serious about this. And remember, if we are obligated to act under NATO's Article 5, we're not obligated as a nation to march all the way to Moscow and conduct regime change. We're obligated to liberate any ground that was taken and then continue to defend the territory of the 28 member states. And that's what needs to be very clear, that we're serious as a heart attack when it comes to defending NATO's territorial integrity, because if we show we're serious and we act like we're serious, then we will never have to do it, in my opinion.
Anybody else want to respond to that? Or?
Next question. We're speaking a lot about the Baltic states and a lot about Ukraine. What's happening inside of Russia? For instance, okay, Nemtsov might have been doing something, but what, I mean, there are protests and demonstrations in Moscow on behalf of, the free Russian people, in effect. Is that having any effect? Are there any politicians in the Duma who are, fostering independent Russia or free Russia from Putin, that type of thing?
Well, the only sort of opposition leader of great stature in Russia that was unambiguously opposed to the annexation of Crimea was gunned down behind St. Basil's Cathedral a couple months back in February. There is no systemic opposition left in the Russian Duma. The opposition has had a real time, together and got together for the Nemtsov march and essentially a funeral march. But at the same time, what happened in 2011 after the switcheroo, when Putin basically told the Russian people that the joke was on them and he was coming back, and you had the Duma elections, you had 100,000 people in the streets of Moscow and thousands in the streets of cities across Russia. No one expected it. It happened just like that. It shook the regime to its core. These things can happen quickly and unpredictably. And again, who would have thought that something as sort of technical and wonkish as an association agreement with the European Union, of all places, would have led to literally the fire and ice we saw in Kiev in February of 2014 and the snipers and everything that's followed. So, again, it doesn't take every city in Russia, and you don't need to poll across the whole federation to affect and shake the Kremlin, right? Revolutions happen in the capital city.
Well, let's not forget that the only member of the Duma who voted against the annexation of Crimea, he was stripped of his Duma, his parliamentary immunity. He's here now. Yeah, he was stripped. He was stripped of his immunity. What are they going to do? All of the other opposition leaders. I mean, they've Navalny. He's under house arrest. His brother was imprisoned for 2 years, just to punish Alexei Navalny himself. We know what happened to our friend Boris Nemtsov.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Open Russia operation inside Russia is continually raided, and even a couple days ago, Natalia Polevina, another opposition leader, had her house, I think, raided even just yesterday. So it's a serious situation.
The opposition members that I know, I mean, they're afraid for their own safety, but they're going to continue fighting. But under the current conditions, I mean, it's really difficult. There's fear everywhere in Moscow right now.
When we talk about opposition, I think many of us, in the back of our minds, incorrectly assume that we still like to refer to Russia as a struggling democracy, but really it's a quite successful autocracy. And there was news, I think it was this morning, or it could have been last night, that the two main opposition parties are going to unite on the same platform during the next, the 2016 elections. But as the two previous panelists just pointed out, it's such an uphill struggle. And frankly, I think the Russian people are quite happy to continue to eat feta cheese from the North Caucasus instead of feta cheese from Greece. I mean, the targeted sanctions really aren't targeting the masses, and they really haven't felt the pinch. And they're quite happy to continue to rally around the flag around Vladimir Putin.
Well, and especially when regular Russians all believe that Vladimir Putin is the only individual, only person that's keeping stability in Europe, never mind Russia. I mean, what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, again, the total privatization of politics and the inability of sort of the rank-and-file Russian citizen to know and react to their own reality because of the way the airwaves are controlled and the situation. I mean, of course, to be sure, the propaganda falls on us on fertile ground, right?
All right, well, thank you very much. Give our panelists a round of applause.